Welcome to Never Again Is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. I am Phyllis Zimbler Miller, founder of the free nonfiction Holocaust theater project, Thin Edge of the Wedge. And I grew up in a small town in the Midwest of the United States, where our parents and grandparents had emigrated from Tsarist Russia and Poland before the lost century. Yet, in September 1970, only 25 years after the end of World War II, my US Army officer husband and I found ourselves stationed in Munich, Germany, an experience that changed our lives forever. Today, we have a very special podcast on the occasion of International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which has been set up by the UN on January 27th every year, which is the day that the Russians, the Red Army, liberated Auschwitz, even though the actual war did not end in Europe until May 8th, 1945. Auschwitz was liberated on January 27th, 1945. And our guest is my co-host, Dutch Jew Evelyn Markus. She's a psychologist and an activist against anti-Semitism. She is the daughter of Holocaust survivors. She's going to share some of that legacy with us today. In 2006, she immigrated to the United States because of the rising anti-Semitism in Europe. She co-produced the documentary, Never Again Is Now, about her experiences with anti-Semitism today against the background of her parents' story during the Holocaust. Okay, I get to interview my co-host. And the first question is, since this special podcast is on the occasion of International Holocaust Remembrance Day, will you please share the Holocaust history of your parents with us and how they were liberated?
Yes. Hi, Phyllis. Thank you for interviewing me, for your interest in my background story of my family during the Holocaust. So my family lived in Holland for 400 years. My father and my mother met each other in September 1940. That was 4 months after the occupation by the Nazis of Holland. There were no regulations against Jews in Holland yet. They got engaged in 1941, and my father's family had lived for a while. They were Dutch Jews, but they had lived for a while in the years of the Depression. They had lived in Germany, and in 1933, when Hitler came to power, they were still living there. And the neighbor immediately joined the Nazi party and came after them. So they fled overnight back from Germany to Amsterdam. My mother's family, my father's family, so they had experience with Nazis in Germany and decided to go into hiding in Holland right at the first regulations, when the first restrictions started for Jews, because they took it very serious.
What year is this? Tell us when?
1941. They took it very serious to, that Jews were not allowed in certain public spaces, in parks, etc., and had to wear a star. So they immediately arranged, and they were lucky they could, arranged for a hiding place for their whole family, my father's side, and offered to do the same thing for my mother's side. My father and mother were engaged in 1941. And my mother's parents, my grandparents, decided not to go into hiding because there was so much betrayal in hiding, they learned, so they didn't dare to do that. They rather took the chance to obey the Germans, and they had certain papers from their past with which they hoped they could get through and stay alive. So my father was hiding together with his youngest brother, and his parents and his oldest brother were hiding somewhere else. They didn't put too many people together in hiding places because that would be a risk of making noise. And they even had to split up my grandfather and my grandmother because they had a bad marriage. So they quarreled a lot, and that made too much noise.
No.
Yeah, life goes on even in those circumstances. So my father was with his youngest brother, hidden by a police officer, an evangelical Christian family, in the rural area in the north of the Netherlands. They didn't come out of their hiding place until the liberation, which was in 1945 on April 16 by the Canadians. They liberated the Netherlands. And thankfully, my grandparents and his oldest brother had made it safely through the war as well. It was, of course, scary and very inconvenient to be hiding. I have his diary in which he wrote during his hiding, and so he goes through a lot, but at least they made it. My mother's family managed with their special papers they had to convince the Germans not to round them up.
Can you tell us in just a sentence or two what these special papers were?
My grandfather and also my mother, when she was very small, their family lived in Argentina for business reasons in the 20s. So they had Argentinian visa. And my grandfather was convincing the Germans that Argentina was neutral and that German prisoners of war could be exchanged against them. So they had value. They shouldn't, to the Germans, they shouldn't kill them, because then they lost that opportunity. They would lose that opportunity. So he showed them the Argentinian visa all the time, and sure enough, they weren't rounded up for a long time. But in the end of 1943, it didn't help anymore. They were sent to the Dutch concentration camp Westerbork, where all the Dutch Jews who were deported were gathered first. My mother was running she was 18 years old then. She was running a school. She was a school teacher, and the Germans wanted her to run a school as if life is normal. And Frank was one of her students. She always told me that didn't mean anything at that moment, because Anne Frank wasn't famous yet. Then every Tuesday, a train would come in to deport Jews from Westerbork, which was a very difficult way of life people had there. Very difficult circumstances, but it was not as bad as the other concentration camps or extermination camps. So they tried to stay there for as long as possible. My grandfather would go every week to the German commander of the camp and say, listen, you can exchange us if necessary for German prisoners of war. So don't send us further east. Although they did not know what exactly was going on further east in Europe, but they knew that it wasn't good.
It wasn't.
And at some point, somebody from the resistance, who my family knew, came in dressed as an SS officer, the Dutch resistance, dressed as an SS officer, and went to my family and said, don't get on those trains. Don't do it. It's the end. So they managed to stay in Westerbork until 1944, deep in 1944. And in September 1944, they were finally, with one of the last transports, deported to Bergen-Belsen. And they had to, and there they got very ill. There was no food, there was no hygiene. Everybody was ill. they all caught severe illnesses. My mother caught tuberculosis. And then, but they had one advantage. With their papers, they managed to be put in a how do you say, in a special part of the camp where people had these terrible circumstances, but at least they didn't have to work on top of that. So they wouldn't lose more calories working. And then it was the end of April and the Allied forces were closing in on Bergen-Belsen, and the Germans wanted to destroy their the evidence of their atrocities. So they shipped every still living Jew in the camp of Bergen-Belsen, they shipped them further to the east, where there were still gas chambers.
In April of 44, they shipped to the east.
April 45. April 45.
I mean 45.
Yeah.
Okay.
Beginning of April 45. So they were on a train with 2,500 Jews shipped off to the goal was to ship them off to Theresienstadt and gas them there. There were gas chambers by that time at Theresienstadt, and everybody was ill. There was no food, there was no bathroom, nothing, and they were there for 10 days in that train. It was horrible. My mother later on described it. I will get to that. It was terrible, terrible, and they were almost dead. They were so ill, and then suddenly the train was stopped. There were bombs all around them. They were afraid they would be bombed, so they were in like at a war front or something. They didn't know where they were. After a day or so, they tried to peek out of the window or to peek out of the door or to get out of the trains. People wanted to see what was going on. The Germans had fled, so the train was abandoned by the Germans. And my mother went out with her sister, and she wanted to get food in the environment, although they were very sick. She tried to walk, and then they saw tanks, and they were very afraid. They thought these are German tanks, and now they will catch us. So they said, "Heil Hitler!" Pretend, you know, covering their Stars of David on their clothes and pretending they were Germans. But then it turned out that the tanks carried a white star, and that these were the Americans. These were American tanks. And this was on April 13 that the Americans, the 9th American Army, liberated the train with 2,500 Jews in it, among them my grandparents, my uncle, my aunt, and my mother. And that's how they were liberated. So this was, by the way, a few kilometers, a few miles before they would die. In order to get to Theresienstadt, they had to cross a river, the Elbe, and the Russians had already closed in on that river at the other side. So the Germans' plan B was to destroy this living evidence of their atrocities, to blow up the train on the bridge over the river Elbe. And the 9th American Army just stopped that train right before it would be blown up, before it would reach that bridge. And I have a penny here that my mother has carried with her all her life. She passed away in 2014. And it says, in remembrance of the 9th American Army, April 13, 1945. She always was wearing that with her. And on April 13, we would always celebrate every year as a family, the liberation by the Americans, and we would thank the Americans and the Canadians for the liberation of our family. My father started a chewing gum factory with his youngest brother in 1948, and they call it Maple Leaf after the Canadians. So they found each other back, and they survived with both their direct families, for which we are most extremely grateful, because I know no Dutch Jews of my age who can say that their families survived
Intact.
It's a miracle, and we celebrate it. My parents celebrated that every day.
I would like to move on to your documentary, and the bridge is that in the documentary that we're going to talk about next, you actually have a part when you get together with some of the remaining members of the unit that liberated your mother's family. And it's a very moving segment of your documentary. So the documentary is called Never Again Is Now. Could you give us a little background, and do tell us about that particular reunion scene?
Sure. So the documentary Never Again Is Now is about a couple of things. It starts with the story of my parents that I just told you, the Holocaust history of my family. And then it moves on to my lifetime. I'm born in 1959, after the war, and I grew up virtually without any anti-Semitism, and then suddenly that changed around the year 2000. And today, many Jews want to leave Europe or leave Europe because of the resurging anti-Semitism. And I'm one of those. My partner Rose and I left Europe because of the rising anti-Semitism also in Holland. So that story is told too, why we left Holland in 2006. And then the third part of the documentary is that I interview certain thought leaders and opinion leaders about how come that anti-Semitism is rising in Europe. And then in 2019, we added an epilogue about the rising anti-Semitism now also in the United States. Who would have thought that, right? That would ever happen. So that's what the documentary is about. And in the first block, where we tell the Holocaust story of my parents, the film team suddenly came to me and said, we found a veteran from the 9th American Army. He's 97 years old. He lives in Florida. And we would like you to meet him. And then we will film that. So that's what happens. It was the last reunion of his battalion, where about 20 veterans still alive, all in their 90s, gathered from all over the US. And it was an incredible event. They all spoke, you know, they had such vivid memories of World War II. And then I met that veteran his name was Frank Towers, and he was there. He liberated the train my mother and her family were in. So it was incredibly emotional to meet him and to say thank you to him in person. And that's all in the documentary, and also to hear the story of the liberation of April 13th from his perspective. I knew the story from my mother's perspective, and now to hear it from his perspective was also very interesting.
And very moving for those.
Very moving.
Right. Please, I'm going to say this at the end, but you can see Never Again Is Now on YouTube and Amazon. I'll remind everyone at the end, I highly recommend it. So, but why did you make the documentary?
So I grew up with the stories of my parents. And I grew up in in the Netherlands, in Holland, in Amsterdam, you know, the most liberal country, the most liberal city in the world. And there was hardly, I mean, there was hardly any anti-Semitism, maybe a remark or a joke here and there, but nothing bothered me in that respect, or us, or any Jew in the Netherlands. On top of that, when I came out as a lesbian, I had a great life of freedom in the Netherlands. There were no restrictions. There was gay marriage early on. So it was great to live there. And then around the year 2000, well, when I have to start a little earlier. When I went to university, it was in the 70s, 80s. That environment already had turned heavily anti-Israel. So I would be held responsible there for Israel's actions. But apart from that, no anti-Semitism. And then in around the year 2000, it was the year of the first Intifada. Suddenly, Jews were beaten up in the streets of Amsterdam on their way to synagogue. They were beaten up or thrown stones at. And this violent kind of anti-Semitism mainly came from, or only came from, Muslim immigrants who had come to Europe, also to Holland, in the decades before, in big numbers, and who turned out to hold a lot of not only anti-Israel or pro-Palestinian feelings, but very many anti-Jewish feelings. So whenever something happens in the Middle East where Israel was involved, a conflict, then the Jews in Europe, also in the Netherlands, would be punished physically by people coming from the Muslim immigrant population. Now, so Jews started to not wear Jewish symbols, or no kippot, no yarmulkes in the street. Synagogues would take away the signs that they were synagogues. Everybody was going into hiding again, in a way. And as a child of Holocaust survivors, how could I look away from that? So I became active. At first I did my research. So I went to Jewish organizations. I went to anti-racist organizations. I went to the government and I said, do you share my observations and concern? And what are you doing against it? And the answer was, yeah, we see it, or we're not sure it's really true. And then if they admitted it was true, because then it's, you saw it was going on in the same way in Germany, the same way in Belgium, the same way in France, the same way in the UK. It was everywhere in Western Europe. So they said, well, but what can we do about it? So that is why I made the film. To me, it came. So I wanted to know about, why is there so much hatred towards Jews coming from the Muslim population, and why is there so much hatred of Israel in the left population? We didn't have right-wing anti-Semitism in the Netherlands then, and not so much.
There is now, right?
There is not in Holland, but in Germany there is.
I know.
So, then there was the killing of Theo Van Gogh.
Yes.
In 2004.
Dutch filmmaker.
Who made a film together with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, addressing the inequality of women in the Muslim culture and religion, and he was killed by a Dutch jihadi around the corner of my house. So, and he got, so his throat was slit in the street, and a letter was stabbed to his body saying, Ayaan Hirsi Ali was a member of parliament then in Holland, will be next, but also the Jews. The Jews are behind all evil. So there was a direct connection then in Holland of terrorism, lethal terrorism, and anti-Semitism. Now, I started to look into where does the Muslim anti-Semitism come from? And it turned out that it has a lot to do with Israel and the Palestinians, but not only. It's also how people are raised. And there are also elements in the religion, like we used to have in Christianity as well. There are elements in the religion that are anti-Semitic. So the numbers of anti-Semitic, of people holding anti-Semitic attitudes, is 4 times as high in the Muslim population everywhere in the world than of the rest of the population. So this, and there are a lot of Muslims in the world. So suddenly I saw this is not just a prejudice here or there. This is a huge anti-Semitic force. Not all Muslims are anti-Semitic, but a lot are. A huge force that is a threat not only to Israel, but to Jews everywhere in the world. So I couldn't look away from that. And I wanted to also especially give a warning and make the American population aware of this, because I thought there are no borders for this kind of developments. This could easily also come to the United States. And that's why I made the film.
So what did you think? You could tell us about why you chose the title, but I really want to get to, what did you think when I came to you in the early summer of 2021 and said, I asked to meet you and said, what do you think about having a podcast about anti-Semitism?
So I do get to the title. The title of the documentary that I chose was Never Again is Now. And what I meant with that is that my parents taught me a lesson from the Holocaust. They said, we could have stopped Hitler if we would have taken him seriously earlier, sooner, when he was still, not that powerful, and we could have stopped him when he was not that powerful, but we didn't, because we thought, it's not going to be so bad. He's not going to do what he says he's going to do, etc. And by the time they had to take him seriously, they couldn't stop him anymore. I saw this growing development of resurgent anti-Semitism in Western Europe, but also at some point coming to America. So I chose the title Never Again is Now. And the message of the film, if you watch it at the end, the message of the film is, what will you do to stop anti-Semitism? I strongly believe that governments alone cannot stop this, that NGOs alone cannot stop this. We all have to do our part if we want to make sure that anti-Semitism is contained or decreased.
And that's why I came to you.
And so,
yes.
Yeah, so when Phyllis called me in the summer of 2021 and said, I saw your documentary, and my answer to your question is, why don't we start a podcast about anti-Semitism in which we make people further aware of anti-Semitism today, and also give them guidelines or tools how to speak up in their own way against it. I thought that is the most perfect effect of my documentary I could wish for, that somebody sees it, gets her own idea, and a very effective idea that is not so difficult to do, right? With the technology of today, you set up a podcast pretty easily. So all it took was our commitment to do it, and bring in our experiences and expertises we already had, and here we are. So now we're reaching more people than with my documentary, to make them aware of anti-Semitism, and also we try to give them tools to speak up themselves, and we will soon promote the podcast further so that we get an even bigger audience. We're not in this for the money. We do this, we are just invest our time, and there are luckily people helping us to cover out-of-pocket costs. But that's so I thought it was. I was thrilled, Phyllis, when you called me.
And as we say, the rest is history. But here's the part that we do every time with our podcast. We look for ideas to give people. Not everyone has to be Oscar Schindler. What we feel very strongly, and by the way, the name of my play, Thin Edge of the Wedge, is about that you say nothing, you say nothing, you say nothing. It's a British expression, until it's too late. So what we like to give at the end of each podcast is some tips on what people can do individually. Yes, it's great to join an organization. It's great to donate money to ADL and other organizations. But in our everyday life, there are chances that we frequently pass up. Someone makes a Jewish joke and we think, oh, it's just a joke, not realizing that that joke can perpetuate negative stereotypes, such as we saw in Texas 2 Shabbats ago, the Jews control the world. So Evelyn, give us a couple of ideas of things that we can say as individuals.
I think it's important, if you are in circumstances where you hear an anti-Semitic remark, it very much depends on in what circumstances that is. Is it at a dinner table with friends? Is it in university in class? Is it during a presentation? Is it at work? All those circumstances are very different. But just in general, it works if you can. It works best many times if you can get across, if you speak about yourself, that you say, I feel offended by what you just said. I feel dehumanized by what you just said. Instead of saying, you dehumanized me and you are a racist, Right. So point the finger to yourself and express
how you feel.
Another word for that is assertiveness. It's also helps if you can say, if it keeps happening, like, I find it unacceptable to hear those remarks.
And sometimes, can I just say because we only have a couple minutes and I want last thoughts, sometimes it's literally just educating people. They have no idea. Growing up in the Midwest as the only Jewish child in my public school classes, they have no idea that it's anti-Semitic.
Also, yes, and also if you feel that, it also turns out that we know this from psychology, that lecturing is never the best way to get something across. But asking questions like, it offends me what you just said, and I think it's incorrect, also factually incorrect what you say about Jews, but do you have numbers? Do you have, where did you see that idea about Jews?
Why do you think that?
Why do you think that? Yeah. And then they will soon run out of gas, and then and then the audience that is there, the others that are there, understand that they shouldn't believe that person.
Yes. And that's something that we can all do. I very much believe in assertiveness training theory, and we stay calm, we don't accuse people, and then we hope that they're open to listening. Okay, Evelyn, you got 2 minutes for your last words.
Okay, we Both Phyllis and I, you know, find it so important that we all do our part against anti-Semitism. If we think about it, there are billions of anti-Semites in the world, and there are 50 million Jews in the world.
Say that number again.
Sorry?
The number again. I couldn't hear you.
There are billions of anti-Semites in the world, according to the Anti-Defamation League, who monitors that. And there are just 15 million Jews
15.
in the world. Okay. So first of all, every Jew, as far as I'm concerned, should help. We need every Jew to help stop anti-Semitism. But we cannot even do it alone as Jews, as 15 million Jews. We need non-Jews as our allies to do that. So, and I don't think we need, for the grassroots level, that's very important. The grassroots level gets involved, every individual there, to stop some of the anti-Semitism. And we don't want to give a cookbook for everybody the same. Do whatever is in your expertise, your power, your strength, whether it is reading the textbooks of your children or grandchildren to see if there's any anti-Semitism in it, and if so, try to address it with the authorities to change that, or invite a neighbor and have them take note of what Judaism, invite them for a Shabbat dinner and let them experience the positive Judaism, or get involved with an organization that fights against anti-Semitism, or check your temple or school that is partnering with interfaith dialogue partners to see and check the background of those organizations that we are partnering with. Are they really into making peace and human rights for everybody, or are they using us for more extremist goals? So when you look at Jewish Muslim interfaith dialogue in America and also in Europe, you see a lot of partnering of Jewish organizations with Muslim organizations that are not at all tolerant, but they present themselves as tolerant. So find the real tolerant Muslim communities and partner with them instead. Those are, you could discuss that with your rabbi. What do you know about that organization? Also on the internet, report if you see white supremacist remarks, flag it, report it, try to make it as difficult as possible for that person to put on more on the internet.
That's a very important thing, because lots of social media platforms allow you to report anti-Semitic speech. Our time has run out. I thank you, Evelyn. This has been so informative. I really appreciate your letting me interview you. I thank our listeners. Again, you can watch Evelyn's documentary, Never Again Is Now, both on Amazon and YouTube. If you go to thinedgeofthewedge.com, you can read more about my free nonfiction Holocaust theater project. And please, whenever you can, without putting yourself in physical danger, speak up against anti-Semitism and hate.